Okay, I thought it would be fun to start out with some basic myths around open source licensing. There's a common viewpoint that, particularly in the enterprise world, that when you grab an open source package, there's usually one, maybe two licenses that apply to all the files. Okay? That's just not true in most cases. What we have found is files could actually be covered by half a dozen, if not a dozen licenses, and we'll see examples of that, and why SPDX helps us in understanding that. Another myth is software companies don't really care about license compliance. Again, that is false. Very false. In fact, this whole SPDX effort was driven by companies who truly want to do the right thing, but trying to understand the true licensing terms has been very challenging by rummaging through hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of files within an open source package. Myth 3. Some of the BusyBox binaries are only covered by the GPL version 2. Most of them are covered by GPL 2, but there are other licensing terms potentially that apply as well, and we have to be aware of that. Another myth is linking a GPL file with a BSD file makes the BSD file GPL. That's not true at all. You have two different sets of license wishes from the different developers or copyright holders, and you have to honor both sets. And we'll show examples how SPDX helps you manage that. And finally, the third myth I wanted to point out was that by merely giving out the source code, I'm compliant. Well, it goes a long way towards being compliant. This is very true. But oftentimes there are additional terms that you have to be aware of in order to honor the wishes of all the copyright holders of the code you are using. Okay? And SPDX will help you with that as well. And we'll give examples. Okay. So, just a quick note about our experience with SPDX. Our group is a contributor to the Linux Foundation Working Group, to its development. We participated in the SPDX 1.0 pilot. We partnered up with HP, and we had a very successful exchange of licensing information with respect to certain packages between the two of us. And finally, we have been experimenting with SPDX 1.0, and we've been looking at some very popular packages such as BusyBox, WebKit, and the kernel. The agenda of this talk is really simple, or hopefully it's viewed as simple. We want to focus on what the intent of SPDX is, what the guts of SPDX are, and what's the true benefit or power of SPDX to the embedded developer. Okay, and I want to highlight this is purely an embedded developer perspective. It will take certain turns that it might not be of interest to the enterprise people. Okay, let's start with the intent. I put a simple definition up there, we all can read it, but I want to highlight something very key here. This is not necessarily the complete view of SPDX from all users of SPDX, but from an embedded perspective, just knowing the licensing terms with respect to all the files that go into a particular runtime, whether they be just libraries or programs, is what it does best. It gives you on a file-by-file basis the true licensing terms or your distribution requirements with respect to those files. Some simple characteristics of SPDX are as follows. As we noted, it covers licensing information, copyright licensing information for the respective files. You'll see in the next slide it doesn't cover patents. All that information is stored in a single file. This is a huge step forward because to understand licensing of all the different files, you normally had to rummage through thousands or tens of thousands of files and try to make sense of all that. Here, SPDX delivers that information in a single file with a single exchange. As I noted in the previous definition, it is very powerful at delivering the distribution requirements, the wishes of the copyright holders for your particular runtimes. And it's actually, it's all about the syntax. It's an agreed upon syntax that's very easy to be read in and exported by tools, which is obviously going to be very important when you want to automate some of these tasks. There are two formats that are supported in the SPDX spec, RDF XML and name value tags. That's largely because the enterprise guys like XML and the Linux guys like name value tags. And finally, another characteristic is, in theory, it's supposed to be human readable. It's kind of, but not really. I don't think you really want to sit through and rummage through XML files. But that was the intent. But once you have it in an XML file, guess what? What you can do with tools to generate lots of powerful information, viewers, different views of it, reporting, even dashboards, right, of that data. It's tremendous. Okay. It is not, okay? It only includes licensing information that can be determined by looking at the actual content of the package. You're not allowed to go look at some website, an external source, when that file is created, right? It doesn't give you any guidance on how to use the data. It's the raw facts. The raw facts about the licensing terms. Okay? It does not include any patent information. It's purely copyright licensing terms. It does not include any legal interpretation on how to respond to that stuff. Okay. So, one of the most simplest objectives of the effort were to enable the users of open source to honor the wishes of all the copyright holders of the open source files found in the package. Okay? You know, in more simpler terms, to make compliance a lot easier. Another objective, which is very related, is to facilitate the sharing or exchanging of licensing information among all the different vendors who participate in the creation of an embedded runtime. Okay? I don't know how many of you are familiar with EDI, but it's been around for several decades, and it's a very common exchange format used to share information between manufacturers. So if Toyota wanted to reorder a whole set of components for a certain vehicle, they would go into the system and communicate that information to all their suppliers via EDI. It's a record structure. Another analogy, if you're not familiar with EDI, would be maybe medical record exchange. You can imagine eventually our medical records could be all put in a standard representation, and you could pass that on to from your pharmacist, from your doctor to your pharmacist, from your pharmacist to the hospital and back to your doctor. Okay, before SPDX, there were a lot of efforts to mine this licensing information and to represent it. And unfortunately, a lot of people were doing the same thing over and over again, and it was very costly, okay? In very inconsistent ways. For example, they all had different file representations. It was very common to share licensing information via spreadsheets or Word docs or even text files. There was a lot of different types of labeling or naming things, particularly licenses, right? And of course, what exact information are you going to deliver? It's an agreed upon set of collection of information you're going to deliver. They had different objectives for creating that information. It also is very error prone, you can imagine, and finally very costly. Okay. Why would SPDX be particularly important to the embedded person or the embedded developer? First of all, unfortunately, a lot of the legal actions taken on the licensing front have largely been against distributors of embedded devices. Embedded developers typically like to go down and grab subsets of files from packages. Unlike possibly the enterprise world where they usually take the whole thing, maybe build it, not very concerned about how the underlying sub-files or libraries and sub-pieces or sub-directories are arranged. So getting information on a file-by-file basis is very critical, and we'll see examples of that. And again, regardless of the type of embedded platform, this nature of doing things is very critical, understanding at the license level. Okay, so now I want to transition to talking about the guts of SPDX. So everybody here, I'm assuming, is very familiar with what a software package is, right? It's made up of a bunch of files, some libraries, and some executables. And again, this is just more of a visual of how one might want to look at that massive effort of trying to go through at all those files and determining licensing information. And what's really important is in truly understanding the licensing of the device you're shipping, all the licenses that apply, you have to start with the file. And of course, a given file in a particular package may be under one license. And another file would be under a different license, all in the same package, right? Just looking at the overarching governing license of a package is not that helpful, okay? And of course, it's possible for files to be under more than one license. It might be a license choice. You might be given a choice between one or the other. Or it may be the case that someone collected up code from several different sources, and each time they grabbed some code, that code came from a file under a different set of licensing terms. So that file would be under all three sets of terms. Okay? And of course, if you want to understand the licensing of a given library, right, the natural thing to understand is the licensing of its respective files, okay, which will tell you the licensing terms for that library. And oftentimes, it's not just one license. It's a collection of licenses. Okay? And of course, this is a natural progression that if you want to understand the licensing terms of a particular application, you want to understand the libraries and the files from which you will end up with one program or one utility can be under a half a dozen, if not a dozen licenses. It's very common. It's a very common situation. And understanding those licenses is what SPDX is all about. Communicating that information so that you can understand that application has these distribution requirements. Okay, simple visual for the holistic runtime or target. So you have this piece of hardware, the X phone, right? And we know that they have lots of applications, and naturally those applications themselves have licensing information that apply to them. But to truly understand, you have to go deeper. So we'll throw out the license bucket, okay? And you're going to look at the kernel. And you have to understand and generate an SPDX at the kernel level. And look at all those licensing terms and put them in your bucket. Next, you want to understand the licensing terms for all the respective system libraries, okay? And again, they're going to have their set of requirements, all right? And of course, if you really want to understand, you have to understand the licensing obligations for all the different applications that run on top of that device. And of course, there's a whole other collection of licensing terms to consider. So in the end, you end up with a single device. Yet, you have a whole list of set of distribution requirements that apply to that device. Yes, maybe giving out the source code goes a long way to satisfy many of those obligations. But if you truly want to understand and honor the wishes of all of the copyright holders, you have to be able to look at that in a very systematic way. And that's what SPDX allows us to do. Okay, so an SPDX file, as I mentioned, is a single file of a collection of all the licensing information found in the open source package. Okay? And it's broken out into 6 sections. Okay? I'm going to quickly just go through these sections so you have a basic understanding of it. And so the first section is, the other thing I like to point out is when you look at an SPDX file, I generally like to think of in terms of a spreadsheet. It's a single spreadsheet with multiple worksheets, okay? And each of those worksheets are represented by each one of these sections. So a worksheet in a spreadsheet can have one or more rows, right? It turns out that this first section would probably have only one row of information, a record of information, right? And it's going to have the basic specification version, right? It's going to have a data license. The license we're talking about here is the license that applies to the SPDX data, the actual data in the SPDX file. They even went so far as to be complete to associate a license to the data. And it turns out that they're looking at the Creative Commons 0 license for that license. So the next section, or you might want to think of it as the next worksheet, is simply information about who created it, when, and some comments they might have for you. Okay? Pretty simple stuff. The next one would be the package. The basic overall arching information about the package. Right? Name, full file name, a checksum for the package. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a few slides. Now, the next section is, the first 3 are just single record worksheets. Right? Just one single record. The next one is a collection of records, a list of identified licenses that you found in the file that are not official SPDX licenses. We'll talk about that. Then there's basic file information, as you might imagine, some basic core record information about each file in the package. And finally, some reviewer information. So if you have new people come along down the road who picked up an SPDX file and want to add to their analysis, they can add their names into them. Okay, so we're going to focus in on just these three for this. I think that will give you the gist of what we want to cover here today. So let's begin with the package information. Really simply put, again, as I noted, it's one record. You're going to find the pretty standard information. The originator, supplier, where it was downloaded from, the package checksum, verification code. This is like a checksum, but it allows you to add the SPDX file into the package, right? If you did that, you would normally screw up the checksum of the package, right? But they came up with a mechanism for creating a special code that you could take the same package, and that you know you're looking at the same instance of it, and you can add the SPDX file to it. I won't go into great detail. You can read about it if you're interested on the SPDX website and how that algorithm is configured. Declared license is simply the license that the authors of the package have declared it to be. Okay? There's something else called license concluded. Well, that's license concluded by the SPDX analyst. Often, it's the same, but they may come to a different conclusion, and then they'll have to clarify that in their comments. And then they just want you to provide a complete index of or table of contents of all the licenses found. Okay. So, we talked about licenses. SPDX, the consortium, has defined a standard set of licenses, right? These are things, it's a superset of what the OSI has approved, okay? And these are just licenses that are commonly encountered. Now, you have the common, the usual licenses, such as the GPL, EPL, Eclipse, Apache, and so forth. They decided to add a slightly, a new kind of license name, which is, like in the case of GPL 2+, it's simply when you come across a file and it says GPL under the GPL or under the GPL 2 or later version, they wanted to give you the ability to put a plus in. So, but you know, it's pretty straightforward. You have a standard set of licenses. These are the licenses you're allowed to use. Now, you have to ask the question: what happens if I'm looking at a file and I came across a license? It's not in the list, right? You need a way. So that field, this section of the document allows you to define them. So essentially you get to create this dictionary of licenses, not part of the SPDX standard license list. So, really simple. It's a straightforward set of obligations. You know, you're allowed to use, distribute, and modify the software. However, there's really no standard SPDX license that would uniquely identify this. Okay? So, really simple. You get to create one and put it inside the package. It's published inside the package. Okay, here's another one. This is simply saying, you know, you can distribute this, you can copy, you know, create derivative works as long as you don't use this name of this institution, University of Michigan. And again, you're going to end up with a record you're going to create, and it's going to end up in the SPDX file. And then finally, you have an interesting license notice here, where it says you're allowed to freely distribute, and you're allowed to use and distribute. However, it's not really granting you any rights to modify, is it? So that would be a case where it's really important to document that license and again add it to the list. So we end up with, you know, you can imagine a collection of package specifically defined licenses. Okay. And finally, we have the info section. The file info section, pretty straightforward stuff. You know, here's a file under GPL 2 or later. You're going to end up with a file name, source, whether it's binary source or other, checksum for the file, you know, the license information in file. So they make a distinction here. It's very important to take note of exactly what was found in the file in terms of licensing. It turns out that you could potentially come up with a different conclusion because, for example, there may be no information in the file and you find out there's another licensing.txt file. So you get to define for each file the actual explicit licensing terms found inside the file, and then also what you concluded it to be. Almost always, not almost always, often it is equal to the concluded license. Okay, so here's another example. We already saw this one. This was a license notice that we had to create a license rep for, And you can see by looking at the license in file is basically license ref 34. Now this is not a standard license in the SPDX list. Okay? So you get to make reference to it by simply using the reference you gave it. Here's another example of a file which has two licenses that apply to it. So the first one is under GPL v2 or later, and the second one is under the BSD 3 clause. Okay? So naturally you want to represent that, and so you end up with license in file. You've identified it to be GPL2 and BSD 3 clause. They both apply, right? This is a license expression, which is a combination of several license literals. Okay? So here's another example where you get to choose. A very common situation, you know, a dual license option. So you can imagine, you can see the license in file, BSD 3 clause or GPL 2.0. Okay, so you can actually carry over that option, and you could put it in the concluded field. You could say it's under BS3 or GPL 2.0. Or you as a distributor can actually choose one of the two. It's your privilege. It's your option, I should say. It's your option given to you by the copyright holder. And then finally you come to a file where there is no licensing information at all in the file. Right? So again, it's really important to kind of come up with a conclusion. So it's very important that you specify that no license information was found. However, I concluded it's under the GPL 2.0. And you tell them how you concluded that in the license comments. It was based on the copying file that was found in the directory, right? Remember, the licensing information has to come or be derived or determined by all the information contained within the open source package. Right? You're not allowed to go outside some website. So naturally, when you're done, you're going to have a lot of records for each file. And I thought it would be, just worthwhile to give you a little bit of, glimpse into the actual, guts of a SPDX file. I don't think we want to spend a lot of time there. However, as I mentioned, it's a single file, and it typically will be implemented either in XML RDF or name value tags. Here you have a simple field that says license in file GPL 2.0. The first bullet shows you, the XML for the GPL. And the name of the value tag would be found in the second bullet. Okay. So here was an example we had just recently saw. So we'll look at this is the equivalent XML. Okay. What I highlighted in red is simply you can see up there it says none on the top here, and then you can see it has GPL2 concluded, source, and then some basic information. Okay. Let's look at another example. Again, we talked about the list of defined licenses found in the package. Let's look at this individual one. You want to create the equivalent SPDX, XML representation. Pretty straightforward stuff. The great thing here is you can see it's very parsable by any tool. So what we have is the original text here, and then the license rep that was given to it by the SPDX creator. Okay. At this point, I'm going to pause briefly to ask if there are any particular questions about the first two sections. Yes?
So is there a disclaimer on you're deriving information here, is there a disclaimer on the SPDX files themselves saying you should verify it? Like, there's been interpretations
right.
by the person who wrote this license summary.
So the intent of SPDX is to try to work with raw data, right? Raw evidence. It's not always easy, such as you may be pointing out, that you have to sometimes conclude something that's, you have to draw a connection. There's nothing is said in the specification about disclaiming information. However, what I expect is there's at the top of the SPDX document is an ability for the creator to add comments about their analysis. There's one section that goes, creator comments. And I expect many people will put their legal disclaimers in there as well as maybe some guiding principles that they used to generate the SPDX file. Now, one other point is worth noting. Not all SPDX files are going to be created equal, right? The quality could vary considerably. That is true. But once you have it in a format such as an XML or name value tag, you can actually do comparisons against different files and see how, and get a better sense of how far apart they are. Yes, you had a question.
So, you said there was one package entry per SPDX file. Does that mean SPDX file applies to a package?
Yes.
One per
yes. SPDX is supposed to, it's a single file of all the licensing information found inside a single open source package. Yes?
So if I was an upstream author maintaining information from every, and I wanted to ship SPDX with my package, maintaining this information for every file is monotonous. If you're upstream, can you have a wildcard file that says everything that is source code under here is under this license?
There is no wildcard syntax or way of specifying that. However, a lot of times SPDX files are generated using some kind of automation, some tools. It's a combination of human and tool. And you can have a tool go through and just designate every single one file in this directory to have a certain license term.
So that means you have to do it with every release, whereas if you have some type of wildcard, then even your currently committed version would still have a correct SPDX file.
It's a very valid point. And I think it's also worthwhile for me to communicate this situation to the SPDX group, because this is just the beginning, right? And we have 1.0 out, and they're working on 1.1 and 2.0. So I think it's a very valid point. There is no way right now to specify the wildcard situation. Okay?
Sorry, one last thing.
Sure.
You said the Open Embedded Yocto presentations the other day. They were looking at similar, but they do the checksums based on the license block instead of the whole file, which means you have less maintenance to do. So your checksums are based on the complete contents of the file. That is more rigorous, but it's more of a maintenance here.
It is what it is right now, yes. But I think one of the intents for having the precision is that when you come across another package with the same file, if you maintain the stuff in a database and you have the same checksums, you can quickly eliminate doing that analysis of that file. Or if you have an update of an open source package, if you have a new version, and you just have to look at the deltas, then you don't have to look at and do analysis for all the files that have already been done.
Unfortunately, a single byte change will cause your checksum.
That's right. Absolutely.
So even adding, that's a bad example, but even adding a copyright year will invalidate.
That's right.
But that you do want to know the copyright year.
Right. And that's right. So when the copyright changes, that is one of the pieces of information that is recorded. Okay. So that is true. Okay. So the power, the benefits of SPDX. Okay, we've already shown an example of this, right? It's very important because in the embedded world, you're grabbing subsets of files from different places. And if you could pull in and access, say, the SPDX file and quickly determine the licensing of the files you pulled over, you can get a much quicker understanding of what the licensing terms are. Okay? What is also true, as it was intended, right, is it does significantly facilitate the sharing of licensing information between companies. Okay? We had a very positive experience in the pilot working with HP. We had obviously a well-defined set of records, agreed upon records, a single common format, and we were able to build tools very quickly to do simple things in the beginning. And obviously tools can evolve over time. I think this is very important too, greater accountability. So as we prepare these files, we're realizing that there's lots of information inside the packages. There's not enough information inside the open source package sometimes to actually determine what the licensing is, because maybe someone didn't have the time when they prepared the files. But this does force us to, one, pay much more attention to that and to communicate that to projects when we realize it. It also allows us to determine when maybe potentially things are incompatible. All right, and that you can't combine certain files together. So here's an example in the corner of an application which is under, potentially under the GPL 2.0 and Apache 2.0, and it turns out that they're not compatible. the two sets of licenses of these, you cannot combine these two files into a single new work because you can't simultaneously satisfy both sets of requirements. Okay? And so that's something you want to be able to detect as well. And as I pointed out, it sheds light on some of the licensing deficiencies that are found in packages today, and it will help open source projects pay attention more and be able to enable people to honor their wishes better. Okay, so again, I'm kind of repeating this point, but it facilitates or promotes a certain licensing discipline, because ultimately, at the end of the day, open source projects want people to use their stuff. That's a big deal, right? And you just want to facilitate adoption and make it really easy for people to understand what the true licensing terms are. Otherwise, sometimes their organizations don't allow them to use it. So something really as simple as, if every single file simply had a license notice in it, it would go a long way to facilitating and automating this process. It also enables the community to build on each other. Different open source projects take software from other projects, right? You, as a project, have to know the terms of those other projects. You have to honor their wishes as well as you want people to honor yours. And also, as people improve upon a particular SPDX file, the actual information in it, and then they pass it along, someone else, they may not get all the information, but others can work on it too, and we can build on each other. And finally, as I pointed out very early in this presentation, it's really important to be able to get really good licensing reports out on that open source package. And the sky's the limit on what you can do once you have well-structured information in a syntax that can be read by a tool. So the lessons learned in working with the SPDX 1.0, it is the first version, so we understand that. So as I mentioned, it is a very effective way of sharing information between vendors. That the real benefit is gleaned from having to understand licensing information at the file level, which I mentioned earlier is not always the case for the enterprise users. SPDX definitely has, there are definitely things we have to work on, right? So for example, sometimes being compliant is making sure you include a certain license notice in your documentation. And right now we can't always get the exact same BSD 2-clause or 3-clause notice in there. And hopefully over time it'll evolve, which is the next point I believe. We do expect new progressions of new benefits to come out with future versions. Again, this is only 1.0. The quality of your SPDX data is really a function of tools and human input at some level. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, not all SPDX files are going to be created equal, right? What we found is tools are absolutely necessary to making this tractable. However, sometimes because of missing information, a human being is required. But the tools are absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. But there's a particular process that has to be put in place in order to do high-quality SPDX files. We were able to generate what we call high-quality SPDX files and low-quality. We call them high-def or low-def, all right? And the two extremes. But it depends on how much. It's a resource issue, right? Time and resource. And SPDX can easily be integrated into a build system. So we quickly, we went over the benefits of SPDX, and now we can quickly revisit these myths. We know that open source packages have many licenses, not just one or two. So just looking at the top level, 1 or 2 licenses is not necessarily going to help you. Most companies really don't care about open source compliance. We pointed out that that's absolutely not true. That actually, there are a lot of companies involved in the SPDX effort. In fact, they are driving it because they truly want to do this right. And it's been very challenging because, again, going through you can mix GPL and BSD code, but you still have to honor both sets of wishes of both sets of copyright holders. It's absolutely required. And giving out the source code goes a long way towards being compliant, but you may have additional terms. Again, you have to do that, figure that out in consultation with your legal And I mean, here's an example of an application. You can have the GPL, LGPL, and the BSD2 clause. And just giving out a written notice for source code is not sufficient. Would not cover all the terms. For example, if you ship something in binary and give out written notice, the BSD still requires that if you're in binary form, you must give out a certain notice in the product documentation. Okay.